Hey everybody, so I wanted to make a video going over Django. Uh, that tutorial is a lot of reading. There's a lot to Django. Y'all probably noticed in that first assignment, the setup one. Um, and that happens every time. So we have to do that whole setup a project every time. And I know the first week there was some confusion about which files are needed and which ones aren't. So I wanted to walk through that and maybe then take that into the next week's assignment, which where we'll look at views and we start to actually do stuff with Python and um, put together our GUI with HTML so that we can uh, have a nice application to run our GUI. So I wanted to look at some of that. So let's start a project here. I'll start up the terminal and head over to the working directory, which I think is empty. Yep, so it's empty. So I can start a new project here. And in the tutorials, they're talking about a virtual environment. We can set that up. But remember, a virtual environment is just a blank installation of Python. I already have Python installed on this computer, so I don't need another installation. It's not a necessity. It is often a good idea because it's a blank one, which means it's a lot easier to keep track of configuration changes because, well, if we start with a blank slate on that project, we'll know all of the configuration changes, but it's not part of the project. It's not necessary. So I'm gonna skip the virtual environment part here and just use my regular installation of Python. So first thing we need to do is go to Django admin and start a project, which is one word. I always want to spread that out to two words for some reason. And I'm hoping to make a small tip calculator uh, for an example to get up to the building a GUI with HTML. So we'll see a whole bunch of parts here. So I'll go ahead and create that. And now we have this folder here. So let's take a look at the folder there and talk about what the files are first. So I'm on a Windows machine, so I can hit Windows E to get over to the File Explorer where we can see stuff and navigate in here. So here's the project that's set up. And right off the bat, there's this folder that has the same name, which has a bunch of Python scripts in it. And up here, there's this folder called, or this Python script manage.py. And one of the questions that showed up is which files need turned in? The general answer to that is the ones that you would edit. And in general, for Django, this manage.py script is the only one that we're not expected to edit. So everything else here is something that uh, the programmer is expected to edit. So settings, well, let's just look at some of these. So I'll open all these up. Um, there's no open with. Well, I'll go over to my text editor here and open them up. File, open a folder, and I'll open that project here. So we spread this out. Manage.py is kind of the only one we're not expected to edit, but it's not generated as one size fits all. So that is customized to your project. So it needs included. So basically all of the files for the Django project need included, but not a virtual environment if you did that. So if we look at init.py, you'll notice this is a blank file. This is part of the manifest. And when they put the manifest together in Python, they went with the easy one. So init.py, if we leave this blank, it will include everything in our project. If we want to omit something from our project, we list out everything except the stuff we don't want to include. This one's a little more advanced than we'll get to here, but it had just some quick settings, a lot of background things. So we won't necessarily get to that in this class. Settings we will use. So notice in settings, it's saying where the directory is. So path, and this is the current file, and resolve the actual address, and then go to the folder it's in, and then go to the folder that's in, and that should be the top level of the project, is what that line's saying. Some security code. Allowed host is when you go to deploy this online. If you want some material that's stored on another server, Like that's what I usually do with the CSS because the actual Django way is strikes me as more complicated than it needs to be, but we'll see that in an upcoming example. But if you want to refer to another server, like I usually just put the style sheet somewhere else on the internet and then bring it in. That's cross-platform scripting, so we need to include that. And here's all of the apps we're making. We almost, if we're going to make an app, we have to add it to this list. So that's one we will definitely have to do in this class. Other software that's being used, and some pre-built templates. We're not really going to look at those. You can look through some of the things here. Notice we automatically have an SQLite database. So stuff's there. The one we need from settings as far as this class goes and getting started is we definitely need to get back to this list of installed apps. URLs are all of the addresses that we want. So we'll have this, but something that tutorial didn't do that is very, very common in Django is when we start to make apps, instead of putting all of the URLs at the project level, we'll put URLs at the app level as well, and then just refer to them from this one at the project level. So that was what I was planning on doing in a second. So those are the two that we'll need to change here. So settings and URLs, and then again, this one is a bunch of background stuff that we won't get to in this class. So that's what happens when we just create a project. Let's go ahead and leave that open, close that one. But now we need to create an app to go into our project. And we can use the manage.py script to do that. So back over in the terminal. And we can create our app using, so we'll have the Python interpreter. And if you're on a Mac or a Linux machine where it's necessary, remember Python 3. But the Python interpreter, we want to run the manage.py script. And we don't have to run it directly here. We can go ahead and call the function in this one line. We want to call the start app function. The thing is, if we do it from the terminal, we don't use parentheses. We space delimit our parameters. So then the parameter is some sort of name for it. I'll just call it tipping. Because my intention with this video, probably 2 videos, so that they're about 15 minutes each, will be to make a small tip calculator to go through all the parts. Oh, whoops, I'm in the wrong directory. Let me clear that out. So change directory into tipper. All right. Now I'm in the same folder as that manage.py script. So Python interpreter needs to run look at the manage.py script and run the start app function out of there and pass in the parameter tipping, which is going to be the name of our application in this project. Which once again, that's going to give us a number of files we can look at. So back over in the File Explorer, or actually I can probably do it from the text editor here. So you'll notice it created a new folder here with a bunch of files in it. So at the project, we have those gateway interfaces. So we won't get to our gateway interfaces, how we connect to our server in this course, but settings and URLs we'll use for the project. And in the application, we have admin and apps and models and test and views. And in general, views are the big one we want. So we need a way to point to that. So make sure I'm in the correct one. I'll close all these. And in settings.py at the project, we need to add this. So we added a new app called tipping. So just add it onto the list there at the end. Save that and go over to URLs. And we need to tell the computer where this is. So we could add it all here, but as your projects grow large, you'll end up with a huge, massive list that's kind of gets hard to deal with. So what's a lot more common is to just point to the project from here. So to do that, I need to import one other thing here. So from Django.urls, I also want to import include. So then on the next path, You can say, I'm going to add a path and give it the app name, or if we leave this blank, it'll be at the top level of the domain. So I'm going to leave it blank so that it doesn't add anything else to our URL. And I want to include that app name. So tipping, uh, well, really it's this tipping folder. I'm going to put a urls.py script in here. But since this is going in Python code, I don't want to use the slashes. I want to do it with the object-oriented notation, so a dot instead of a slash. So tipping folder dot URLs instead of the tipping slash urls.py. This is how we type that if we're going to do stuff directly in the code with it. So just adding that, and that'll give us then we can create a new URLs folder. So I'll just make a new one here and then save this in the app and call it urls.py. So the same thing, it just helps a lot with organization as projects grow large. And we need these same two libraries, well, the original two. We don't necessarily need to include in the new one. So I'll copy that over, and then we make this identical list. So URL patterns equals a blank list, which isn't going to be a blank list for long. We'll get to that very shortly. And now we're ready to go start doing stuff with our views to make sure this is going to work. So if we open up views here, create views, and what views are our Python functions that send data back to the browser. So essentially they're an API. We could make the API here. Flask has some advantages for APIs. Flask is a smaller version of Django overall. It does a lot more than just make APIs. But notice it imported this from Django import render, and I want to import one more library here. From Django.http, we're going to import HTTP response. Capitalization matters in that. So notice all lowercase HTTP here, capital H and capital R. And what those are is render will look at our HTML templates, which will be in a second video because this is going to be one really long one video. So I'm going to split it up into two videos. And this will just send back a string. So let's do a test case with that. So we create a Python function. I'll just call it greeting. And it needs to take in a request parameter. We can call it whatever we want, but it's a request coming from a client. So most people just call it request. And then we will return something. So we can make a string. So like page is going to be, I don't know, maybe some HTML code. I'll skip a lot of stuff and just write hello world here. And close out all those tags. /body /HTML. And anybody who's had the SDEV153 class, you know there's some parts I'm skipping, but those are just other strings that we could return. And then we can return that. So return, but we want to return it as an HTTP response. So HTTP response, and that particular object will know where the request is coming from. When we get to render, we'll have to state it ourselves. So this will send back that string. So now we're ready to do a quick test case. But I always like to start with this one first because that's a nice example of what views are. We're sending back a string of Unicode text to the browser whenever this page is asked for, which also is how we would make an API. Just set you up a dictionary here and then return that dictionary, And when it gets to the other side, it's going to look exactly like a JSON object if you just return a Python dictionary as text. So now we can come back over to the terminal and start our app. So I'm still at the place where the manage.py script is. So I'll have the Python interpreter, look at manage.py, and do the run server. Uh, wait, is that the right name for it? It's that might be. Oh, sorry, that is the correct name. I had to check some notes. I pulled them out, but hadn't looked at them yet, and then suddenly the different frameworks were starting to run together. So yes, the Python interpreter is going to look at the manage.py script and call the run server function, which when it does, it starts up on our local host 127.0.0.1 is the special address referring to the machine we are currently on. A colon means a port number, and we want port 8000. So if I jump over to the browser and check that 127.0.0.1 on port 8000, we should see the Django message. And then so this is like the top level domain. And then in there, we added the tipper thing. If I go to tipper, getting an error message. So I need to go back and check the URLs to figure out which where the URL is supposed to point. So over here, URLs. So at our project, if we don't add anything, it should point to this other one. And when we get in here, oh, well, here's the problem. It doesn't point anywhere else. It doesn't point to this greeting one. So we need to add that in here. Or if you want, you could put it here. Anything for the class, we probably won't have many, but it's generally better form to spread them out because in most projects you will have quite a few. And what goes here is just a path, kind of like what this is. We need to set up that path, and then what goes in the address bar, and what do we want to happen when that shows up in the address bar. So to this list, I'll add a path, and maybe I'll just follow the name. Oh, I'll change names. So I'll put say hi. When say hi shows up in the address bar, I'm going to call views dot the views script and the greeting method. And do not put parentheses here. So at this point, we need a function to behave as a variable storing instructions instead of data. And later in the background, Django will add the parentheses on to actually run that function. So make sure you leave the functions off. But we need to know about the views script. So we can do that here. So from the current directory, a dot always refers to our current directory. We want to import views. So now we know about the view script, and when this shows up in the address bar, we're going to call this function that we put over here. So save everything and come back over to the browser. So here's sort of our top level domain. And you notice it's expecting to see either admin or say hi. And that's the two things in that URLs folder. So if I look for say hi, we get that message from the string. So quite a bit there. So let's do a quick recap. So we created our project, and then we added an app to it. And once we added the app, we had to go in settings and add that to the list of apps. And then we went in URLs, and instead of putting the URLs we wanted directly here, we just had the URL point into our app. And then created an URLs file here and a views a views file. And what those do is we put a string that we expect to see in the address bar, so the URL for it, and then what function do we want to call, and don't fully call the function yet, just store it, no parentheses, and then Django will add the parentheses later so it'll actually run. And then that function is just going to return a string. That's what HTTP response is. So um, it would probably be used more commonly with a string of, or instead of a string, a big Python dictionary. And then we have an API from Django. That's how we make APIs from Django, but that seems like a good introduction. And this video has gotten over 20 minutes, so I want to split it up into the second one. So the next thing is this render method, because what that does is it will return things from an HTML template. And I'll put that in the next video, so I'll see y'all there in just a moment.